Am I the bad guy for telling my husband he doesn't know how to use chopsticks? Some background: I'm Hispanic, but when my family immigrated from Mexico, they were in an ESL program with a lot of Mexican and Japanese families. My dad learned how to properly use chopsticks from a Japanese immigrant and taught me as a toddler, so I've been using chopsticks my whole life and actually prefer them for certain foods. My husband and his sisters, on the other hand, taught themselves as teenagers, and, well, they struggle. I've never criticized them for it, though. A few weeks ago, we went to an udon festival at a Buddhist temple. While I was eating, an elderly Japanese woman noticed how I was holding my chopsticks and praised me for using them correctly. She asked who taught me, and when I told her, she seemed genuinely impressed. Then, she turned to my husband. She pointed out that he had broken his wooden chopsticks wrong, they were lopsided, and that he was holding them incorrectly. He looked really embarrassed and tried to defend himself, but it was obvious he was self-conscious about it. Fast forward to this week, my sister-in-law was visiting from out of state, my husband prepared a rice bowl for dinner, and my SIL plated everything with forks. I swapped my own fork for chopsticks but left their bowls alone. That's when they started making fun of me. Why can't you just eat it with a fork? Do you really need chopsticks? Oh my God, you're being so pretentious. At first, I tried to explain that I just prefer them, but when they kept mocking me, I snapped back with, "At least I know how to use them correctly." Silence. My husband turned red with embarrassment, and my sister-in-law looked uncomfortable. Later, my husband told me in private that what I said really hurt him. I know it was rude, and it didn't help the situation, but I was frustrated. I never comment on what utensils other people use, but they kept picking on me for mine. So, AITA for calling out my husband's chopstick skills. Okay, let's break this down. OP's husband started this whole thing by making fun of her, but when she clapped back just once, suddenly his feelings were hurt. I mean, I get it. Nobody wants to be called out for something they're insecure about, but also, maybe don't start a fight you're not ready to lose. But maybe I'm being too harsh. Let's see what Reddit thinks. Salty Initiative 242 thinks everyone sucks here, but OP's husband started it and has no ground to stand on. They point out that calling OP pretentious and mocking her was 100% meant to hurt, so him being upset when she threw it back at him feels a little hypocritical. They also ask, is he usually like this when you're better at something? OP actually responds, saying her husband is normally very supportive, but this seems to have struck a nerve because he's probably self-conscious about it. Laura Bora agrees that this whole situation probably echoed the public embarrassment her husband felt when the elderly woman criticized him. They suggest that his bruised ego from that moment carried over into dinner with his sister, making him more defensive. They also point out that fine motor skills are hard for some people, and if he's struggling but still using chopsticks instead of asking for a fork, that should be respected. Flying Demon Cat, however, questions whether he was even holding them wrong. They bring up the fact that chopstick technique varies across cultures and regions. Just because one Japanese woman said he was doing it wrong doesn't necessarily mean he was. Miss Ventress jumps in with an interesting personal story. Her Mexican uncle taught her how to use chopsticks after serving in the Korean War, and years later, she worked for a Korean family who told her she was using them Korean style. This just proves that different cultures have different techniques. Lofi Formers, who is Chinese and frequently travels to Japan and Korea, completely disagrees. They argue that there is definitely a wrong way to hold chopsticks. Gunther Time chimes in with a fun fact. They watched a documentary on chopstick usage and were shocked at how much small details change the eating experience. They always assumed chopsticks were basically the same everywhere, but the subtle differences actually matter. Then there's Lokifin, who says that if OP's husband and his sister are consistently struggling, that's probably a sign they are using them wrong. Meanwhile, OwnCan3495 takes a different stance, saying that learning chopsticks as an adult is impressive. They argue that OP seems embarrassed by her husband, and while the old lady had every right to compliment OP, she didn't need to insult the husband. The Pretzel, however, calls OP out directly. They think swapping utensils in front of everyone was intentional, like OP was showing off, and calling her husband out proved that she was being pretentious. But Digital Self-Portrait fires back, saying that preferring a certain utensil isn't pretentious. If OP had swapped her fork for a spoon, no one would have said anything. Why should chopsticks be chopsticks? It's her house, her food, her preference. If her husband and SIL hadn't started mocking her, this wouldn't have been an issue at all. 2. Her husband is clearly insecure about his chopstick skills. And I get it, being called out publicly sucks. But instead of processing that feeling, he lashed out at OP and tried to turn the embarrassment onto her. 3. OP's response was brutal, but deserved. Look, I know a clapback when I see one. OP saw an opening, and she took the shot. Maybe it was a little too harsh, but was it unprovoked? Absolutely not. At the end of the day, husband started this fight and lost. But what do you think? Should OP have been the bigger person? Or was this a fair response to being mocked? Let me know. And if you have ever been publicly called out for something ridiculous, drop your most embarrassing stories in the comments. Because I need to know, how bad does it really get?